I rise today to discuss the situation in Syria and the historic choice facing this Congress and America. I've been deeply concerned about the situation in Syria since March of 2011, when thousands of Syrians from all backgrounds peacefully protested for a change in the politics and the economy of their country. I think many of us believe that these peaceful protests would lead to the end of an autocratic Assad regime, just as other despots have fallen in other parts of the Arab world. Yet President Bashar al-Assad, like his father before him, Hafez al-Assad, responded instead with horrific violence to suppress the aspirations of his own people. With the disturbing help of Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran, Assad has managed to hang on to power and to turn his country into a humanitarian nightmare. I've met in my office here in Washington with the Russian ambassador to the United States on this issue. I visited the refugee camps along the Turkish border. I've talked with the moderate Syrian opposition in Istanbul. I discussed this situation with the Turkish president, Mr. Gül, and their foreign minister, Davutoglu, and met with many Chicago area Syrian Americans. I had hoped diplomatic and economic pressure would bring an end to the mayhem and human suffering in Syria. I know the American people feel a responsibility for those overseas in need and those who are struggling to find freedom. But I also know something else about the people of my state of Illinois, and I believe of this country. They are weary of war. And then came the August 21st chemical attack in the suburbs of Damascus in the middle of the night. At that moment, an important challenge was thrown down to the international community. That's not to diminish in any way the violence that's taken place in Syria over the last several years. Over 100,000 have died in that violence. But when it comes to the use of chemical weapons, the world made a decision almost 100 years ago about their use, even in war. How did we reach this international consensus on this horrible weapon? We saw firsthand what it could do. The large-scale use of chemical weapons in World War I killed many and left many maimed and disabled. Many who have some memory of this war, either from a history class or having spoken to someone who served there, understand what it meant. These photos can't do justice to the devastation of chemical weapons and poison gas, but this is a German gas attack on the Eastern Front in World War I. You can see as that gas billowed that the victims were anyone who happened to be in its wake. This is also a photograph of British troops from World War I who were subjected to the poison gas, the chemical weapon of the day, and blinded during the Battle of Astaire in 1918. These photos show just a snapshot of the use of poison gases which don't reach the level of virulence of those used today. Yet maybe even more poignant are the audio recordings of the actual former World War I British soldiers maintained by the BBC for generations so that the experience would not be forgotten. Let me share one excerpt of British troops struggling to cope with the effects of chemical warfare, and I quote, "Propped up against a wall was a dozen men, all gassed. Their colors were black, green, and blue, tongues hanging out and eyes staring. One or two were dead and others beyond human aid. Some were coughing up green froth from their lungs. As we advanced, we passed many more men lying in the ditches and gutterways. Shells were bursting all around." This BBC report goes on to say, "My respirator fell to pieces with the continual removal and readjustment. The gas closed my eyes and filled them with matter, and I could not see. I was left lying in the trenches with one other gassed man and various wounded beings and corpses, and forced to lie and spit, cough, and gasp the whole day in that trench." And another soldier, recorded by the BBC, said, "The faces of our lads who lay in the open changed color and presented a gruesome spectacle. Their faces and hands gradually assumed blue and green color, and their buttons and metal fittings on their uniforms were all discolored. Many lay there with their legs drawn up, clutching their throats. As a result of the horrors of World War I, in 1925, the Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. It was drawn up and signed at a conference held in Geneva under the auspices of the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations. This happened in June of 1925. It became a force of law in February of 1928. Syria was a signatory to this agreement. Let me read the opening of this protocol. It's even relevant today. Quote, "Whereas the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and of all analogous liquids, materials, or devices has been justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world, and whereas the prohibition of such use has been declared in treaties to which the majority of powers of the world are parties, and to the end that this prohibition shall be universally accepted as a part of international law, binding alike the conscience and the practice of nations." Mr. President, what the world was saying in 1925 was clear. These weapons, these chemical weapons, would never, ever be accepted in the civilized world. This message was reaffirmed by the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling, and Use of Chemical Weapons, which went into effect in 1997, and to which almost every country in the world has signed. Almost every country. Those who have not signed: Angola, Egypt, North Korea, South Sudan, and Syria. While not completely taken off the world's battlefields, notably in the case of Iraq, which used poison gas against Iran and its own Kurdish people in the 1980s, the global prohibition against using chemical weapons has been largely upheld for almost a century. That is, until last month in Damascus, Syria. Syria has one of the largest stockpiles of chemical weapons in the world. At our hearing last week, I asked General Dempsey whether the reports, which we have from the French, were accurate. They reported that the Syrians now have almost 1,000 tons of chemical agents and hundreds of tons of the deadly gas sarin, which has been detected in the pathological investigation of those who were victims on August 21st in Damascus, Syria. Despite all international and warnings not to do so, the Syrian government is literally a superpower when it comes to chemical weapons, and has such an arsenal on such a large scale that on August 21st, in the desperation of war, Bashar Assad unleashed these chemical weapons in his own city on his own people. These are horrible pictures of what happened as a result of that attack. I've seen worse. One room with children stacked like cordwood, victims of these chemical weapons. We don't believe it was the first time he's used them, and his father used them before him. But it's the largest scale we've ever seen of the use of chemical weapons by Assad in Syria. Syria has crossed a line that the civilized world said must never be crossed. Not only has the community of nations agreed that such weapons are never to be used, but other regimes with weapons of mass destruction or plans for such weapons, including North Korea and Iran, are undoubtedly watching to see just what the world will do now. Now that Bashar Assad has used chemical weapons in Syria, now that the world has reported it, now that the photos are there for the world to see, now that the pathological investigations are completed, what will the world do? Ideally, there's a place to resolve it, the UN Security Council. But sadly, both Russia and China have said that they will veto not only any effort to hold Assad accountable, They have literally vetoed even efforts to pass resolutions condemning the use of chemical weapons without specificity in Syria. Russia's behavior is incredible and particularly perverse, given that thousands of Russian soldiers were victims of chemical weapon attack in World War I. In May 1915 alone, Russian soldiers on the Eastern Front suffered 9,000 casualties, 1,000 of them fatalities as a result of German chemical weapons. Today I was in the airport in Chicago, and the news was flashing about an overture made by President Putin to try to put an end to this controversy. I, of course, salute and applaud any effort to resolve this the right way, in a verifiable way, and to do it with dispatch. What I understand his proposal to be is that the Syrians will somehow destroy their catch of chemical weapons, and of course forswear never to use them. That would be a good outcome, but it will be a difficult outcome because investigating with a third party, such as the United Nations, verifying where these weapons are, removing them from Syria in the midst of a civil war is particularly challenging. If there is a way to do this diplomatically, safely, and to do it in a fashion where we can be certain this type of atrocity will not occur again, we absolutely have a responsibility to pursue it. I don't understand how Russia and China can be signatories to the 1925 Geneva Protocols and the Convention on Chemical Weapons, and then turn around and protect Syria in the Security Council of the United Nations. If there is one international agency that should be involved in any major diplomatic effort to resolve this peacefully, it should be the United Nations. We should call on Mr. Putin to step forward with the leaders in China and say that they will work with the Security Council to execute any diplomatic policy that can avoid further military confrontation. Until then, make no mistake, President Putin's proposal today and the activities we are seeing and hearing from Syria are a direct result of President Obama's leadership. He has stepped up, even though it's an unpopular position with some in this country, and said that we cannot ignore this red line created by the world when it came to chemical weapons. It is time for others to stand up and join us, to join in stopping the advancement and use of chemical weapons once and for all. I've been listening to this Syria debate, and I can't tell you how many times, Mr. President, I've hearkened back to that time 12 years ago when we debated entering the war in Iraq. It was another one of those votes that come along in the course of a congressional career that keep you awake at night. I was serving on the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. I'd sat through hour after hour after hour of hearings about the suspected weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But it never came together in a credible way as far as I was concerned. There was such a rush to war 12 years ago. 23 of us voted no, 22 Democrats and 1 Republican. And I can recall this scene. It was late at night, after midnight, right here in the well of the Senate, when 3 of us were left. It was Kent Conrad, North Dakota, and of course, from Minnesota, our friend and the late senator who served with so much distinction and spoke out so many times on issues of morals, ethics. And we cast the vote no and waited in this empty chamber. I thought about that vote so many times. I think it was the right vote to vote no. But there comes a moment in history where we have to stand up as civilized nations and say to those who are willing to ignore the rules and to break the rules that a line cannot be crossed. I hope that we can get that done, not just in the memory of Senator Wellstone and Senator Conrad, but in the memory of so many who have served here and faced these challenges in the past in our history. I hope that we can find a diplomatic solution which will avoid any military use But I know the reason we have reached this point in diplomacy with this Putin overture has more to do with a president determined to stand up for a matter of principle than almost anything else. We've got to continue to make it clear that we find it unacceptable to use these chemical weapons. We paid a bitter price for the war in Iraq when we were misled as to weapons of mass destruction as a nation. I've seen the evidence in briefings here of this deadly attack in Damascus. I think the evidence is overwhelming and convincing. I think at this point, many Americans are reluctant to even consider the use of military force. So we sat down and drew up a resolution in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. Strict limitations within this resolution about the president's authority and power. 60 days he has to execute a military strategy if nothing else intervenes. 60 days. He can extend it 30 days, but even Congress can object to that if it wishes. He can use military weapons, but only for the purposes specified. No troops on the ground, no troops in combat operations. As Senator McCain said yesterday, that will be part of the law. The president's already said that's his standard as well. So for those who are worried about mission creep and where this might lead us, if God forbid we're faced with that possibility, this resolution strictly limits what the president can do. Mr. President, it was about 8 days ago when I got a phone call at my home in Springfield late on a Sunday night, and a phone call I'll never forget from the president himself. And we talked for about a half an hour. We talked about a lot of things because we go back a long way. And he talked to me about his thought process and what he's taking under consideration in trying to lead the world in this response to chemical weapons. I was one of the early supporters of this president. I believe in him. I believe in his values. I believe he has been honest with me and with the American people about the situation that we face. I know the options are not good. They never are in these circumstances. But I also know that if we turn our backs on this situation, there will be some dictator in Iran or North Korea who will be emboldened to do even more, to use perhaps not just chemical weapons, but even nuclear weapons. There comes a point when we have to take a stand. And I understand, as people that I represent across Illinois have said to me so many times in the last week, why is it always the United States? Why is it that we have to be involved in this so many times? Why do we have to be the policeman to the world? Well, there's a basic answer there. I'd like to believe that we have values that the rest of the world looks up to. Oh, we've stumbled in our own history. We'll continue to, but we continue to fight for those basic values all around the world. And secondly, if you're in trouble in your country somewhere in the world and you've got one call to make, one 911 call, you pray to God the United States will answer. Because we have the best military in the world. We respond to challenges around the world throughout history, and seldom do we leave a residual power base behind. We go in, we do the job, we come home. That's something you can't say for a lot of nations. It's an awesome responsibility. I think the president's doing the right thing. I think his appeal to the leaders around the world, his appeal to the American people, is consistent with our values as a nation. The president doesn't come quickly to war. He's a person that understands, as I do, the heavy price that has to be paid. And he understands there are moments when a leader, a commander-in-chief, a person with the responsibility of protecting his nation in a dangerous world has to step up and lead. If the United States did not take on this leadership role, I doubt that anyone else would have. I take very seriously the president's promise that he won't be putting boots on the ground in Syria. Mr. President, I've been to too many funerals, visited too many disabled veterans to ever want to see us do that again, except when it's absolutely necessary for America's survival. I think what we're doing this week in the Senate is a step in the right direction. and I believe it's a step that can move us toward a safer world. If we can find, because of the President's leadership, a diplomatic response here that avoids further military conflict, but keeps us safe from these deadly chemical weapons, we should pursue it.